Trades. The Jazz have already made 3 trades, and there are hours left on the trade deadline clock. Hours, not days. Technically a day and change. But yeah, the NBA trade deadline is drawing near, and so we decided to get together and talk about what might happen, what has happened, what could happen. The Jazz have been involved in 3 trades already in the months of January and February, and yet somehow still have all of Jordan Clarkson, John Collins, and Colin Sexton on their roster. A bunch of other guys too, mostly young guys, some not so young guys, which all of that tells you that there's a chance that we'll have more fireworks between now and 1 p.m. Mountain Time on Thursday, which is exactly what Mark Pereira and I are here to talk about on this Salt City Hoops podcast. Mark, how the heck are you?
I'm great. I love trade deadline season because I feel like this is where some of the more random things that no one really expects come out. I think free agency you start to think about. You hear rumblings for months, right? And I think examples like the Donovan Mitchell trade and the Rudy Gobert trade, I think shocked us all, and especially the destinations where those players went. But there were rumblings going on for over a year with that. Whereas trade deadline, the middle of the season, I feel like we end up getting more shocks, right? And so I'm titillated to talk about what Utah could be doing this week, especially as in the landscape of the broader NBA. The Utah Jazz are not a relevant basketball team right now, but they are always in the middle of all transactions that can happen across the NBA. It's a big departure from the pre-Danny Ainge era and especially the pre-Quinn Snyder, pre-Dennis Lindsey era, well, a lot of the Dennis Lindsey era too, where trade deadlines would pass and go and Utah wouldn't be involved in anything, right? No picking up second-round picks, no picking up random things to help grease trades along. And with the more complicated salary cap structures of today, with the new CBA and the way that trades need to be so complicated to get the principal transaction done, there's a role to be played for teams that are willing to get their hands dirty. And so I'm excited to talk about this week. We did talk about the draft pick trade between the Jazz and the Suns on the prior podcast. So if you want my thoughts on that, and why I think that was a good deal for Utah after being initially disappointed when I saw it, please listen to that. But we have 2 tiny transactions that have happened in the interim that I think, Dan, you and I should talk about before we start pontificating on what we want the Jazz to do, what we think the Jazz should do. And I think it's just a natural thing to start with the role that the Jazz played in the literal biggest trade in NBA history. A mid-20s superstar who is not on the trade block, surefire supermax extension candidate Luka Doncic being traded out of nowhere by the Dallas Mavericks, which is 40 to 60% of the reason this is a shock, for very little return, or at least a very paltry return compared to if you canvass the entire league to the Los Angeles Lakers, which is probably 10% of the shock and awe that this is. Of course, the Lakers are getting another gift after years and years and years of gifts. Luka Doncic going from the Mavericks to the Lakers trading them Anthony Davis and a single first-round pick. But with the other players that were involved to help make salaries match and what have you, the Lakers had one too many players on their roster. So, Dan, what did the Lakers do?
Well, one too many players, and also, because the Lakers are flirting with second apron levels, they can't take they couldn't take back any more in a trade, but I'm sure Dallas didn't want to take back Jalen Hood-Schifino because that would have pushed them back over the tax, and part of the benefit of this deal to them is it puts them exactly under the tax. So, yeah, they needed to get rid of $3.5 million, which happens to be what Jalen Hood-Schifino makes, and so they punted him the Jazz's way for a couple of second-round picks this season. That was probably the most surprising aspect for me, that the picks that came back were immediate picks. The Jazz had just made the prior deal that you talked about in the last podcast to get, to consolidate their picks, because we've talked all season about how they have 8 guys playing minutes, well, 7 because Taylor Hendricks, but it would be 8 guys, 23 and under, getting major minutes on this franchise. And I just did not think that they wanted to come back next season with 3 or 4 more draft rookies, whether that's first rounders or second rounders. They did get second rounders back. One of them might be a mid first rounder, depending on how Dallas finishes the season. The other pick is a Clippers second rounder that's probably going to be 51, 52, 53. Not a great asset. I think in general, the Jazz did this trade because they just want more seconds in general. And the easiest way to get seconds is to have seconds, because seconds move around a lot. They move around very freely. The Jazz like the idea of having seconds, if for no other reason than because then you can put a floor on a first in a trade, the same way that the Lakers and the Minnesota Timberwolves did, trading the Jazz a first round pick that has very light protection at the top. But if that protection is triggered, the Jazz get a Lakers 2027 second rounder instead, a Minnesota 2029 second rounder instead. The Jazz don't really have the ability to do that, so it's harder to get teams to take a single shot, you get it or you don't kind of swing on a first rounder. And so I do like the idea of just having more second rounders in the kitty. I don't think either of these second rounders will be, major difference makers in a franchise sense, but also the Jazz got two somethings for just sitting around and answering the phone and taking a look at Jalen Hood-Schifino, which, we'll see if he plays. I was in the room yesterday when someone asked Will Hardy about whether or not he's had any contact with Jalen Hood-Schifino since the trade. And he kind of just said, "No, I have not." And that was it. And the terseness of that answer made me go, okay, that's weird. Normally there's some amount of like, hey, we're glad to have you, can't wait to get you in and teach you our system and whatever. The fact that there's been no contact makes me wonder if the Jazz are kind of in wait and see mode. Ken pointed out, my brother Ken Clayton, who also writes for this website, pointed out in a post that just went live right before we got on, that he's in the game notes now, but they have not assigned him a jersey number. More signs that, we'll see how serious the Jazz are at giving a former 17th pick a shot. But yeah, this was mostly just about hey, who's a team that can do us a $3.5 million favor? And the Jazz were that team, and they got a couple of picks for it.
Yeah, my brain is failing me right now, but I forget the circumstances in which we brought Kyra Lewis onto the team last year. But that was another instance of a mid first round pick that was absolutely horrible for New Orleans, and kind of we'll take a look at Kyra Lewis, and then he never played. And when he did
was
play,
part of the Oates trade.
Thank you. Yes, and because he was went from New Orleans to Toronto. That's right. And he was immediately terrible, right? And Hood-Schifino he was a very panned draft pick at the time because he had some serious flaws in his game, and he hasn't really done anything for LA. He hasn't really done very well for their G League team either. So I am not surprised, and he is going to be tank fodder in April, and we'll go from there and send him on his merit. He got his team option turned away by the Lakers, and I really don't care what happens to his rights for the Jazz after that. He is a salary slot. The main question. Go ahead. Yeah.
He got his third and fourth year team options turned down, which is pretty unprecedented for a mid first rounder.
Yeah, you are immediately not useful to us, and it is very, very clear. It's very rare for that to happen, especially as highly as he was drafted. But the comment I keep seeing going around NBA circles, and particularly Jazz circles, is why would the Jazz help the Lakers do this? For two reasons. One, it's the Lakers. Why would you help the Lakers do this? But one of the benefits of that 2027 first-round draft pick was, well, we're seeing the tail end of LeBron's career, and Anthony Davis doesn't have a lot of miles that he's going to have left. That's a great, juicy pick that they negotiated. So why would they make the Lakers have a longer tail of success by helping them get Luka Doncic? And there's a couple things to report on this. First of all, noting that a lot of the non-Jazz circles are making fun of Danny Ainge for not knowing the principles of the deal before he agreed to take on Hood Schifino. And obviously all the teams have to kind of get together to call the league office and submit the trade. So it's not like he didn't know it at all. He eventually learned it an hour before it was finalized. So you're sitting there being like, oh, did they work one over on Danny Ainge? And why would Danny Ainge help them? Now, I need to tackle these things because I feel a little annoyed. I feel very similarly to how we always had to continue to carry water for Rudy Gobert in the face of preposterous arguments against his quality, right? And it was just like, eventually you just have to say, look, this is what it is. Either you believe it or you don't. Now, on the working one over on Danny Ainge, Dan, I don't know how common it is, but I don't have a problem whatsoever with Rob Pelinka calling up Danny Ainge and saying, look, we have a trade with Dallas. It's going to put us one roster player over. We need to ship off Jalen Hood-Schifino somewhere. Do you want him for a couple second-round picks? Can you help us out with that? In no way am I going to sit there and be like, you know what? I want to know about the entire transaction first before I agree to this. Because all the first response is going to be, okay, we'll call somebody else. And now, if I'm that GM to GM relationship between Pelinka and Ainge is like, well, Ainge isn't as useful as I thought he would be as far as like someone to help grease wheels of trades, and maybe he won't be my first call down the line, right? It really does sound like, with how private and secret this trade was, that Ainge was the first and only call that Pelinka made to help grease this trade. And there's value in being that first call to say like, hey, do you want a couple seconds to help grease a trade that you know nothing about? That's fine. And once Ainge realizes that, then we get into the second part. Now, once Ainge realizes the entire scope of the deal an hour before they have to submit it to the league office, what value is there really in scuttling that deal? Okay, you can, the Lakers pick isn't as useful in a couple years, but all they're going to do is say, okay, and they're going to call the second team that they have on speed.
We'll call the next guy.
We'll call them on speed dial. And one part that isn't reported, yes or no, is whether Ainge immediately got Nico Harrison on the phone privately and was like, buddy, what are you doing? Like, we don't know if he did that or not. But at that point, you should just be kind of happy with, okay, we got a couple seconds here. And you can be, Danny Ainge probably isn't happy that this trade is happening, but he's getting something rather than nothing. And it's not like anyone worked one over on him. They would have done it to any GM.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is the Jazz not participating would not have stopped this deal from going through. Once you get to the point where all you need to do is find a home for $3.8 million and the trade and a trade of this magnitude is happening, like, the hard part of this was done. And now that teams can accept players in trades with their mid-level exceptions, that's what the Jazz did in this trade. They didn't have cap room. They took him into their room MLE. Now that teams can do that, there were a bunch of teams that LA was going to call next. This trade was going to happen. The other observation I'll make about this that I think matters, because, you know, people are talking like this was about to be the fifth pick in the draft until Danny and Justin agreed to this. I don't think that's how the Jazz viewed this Lakers pick. In fact, I talked to someone with the Jazz a little bit after they acquired this pick, who kind of shared with me, you know, the Jazz obviously at any given point have a rough valuation, and it's probabilistic, right? Because you never know what's going to happen with this team or that team in a 7-year span. But from a probabilistic level, they kind of had a rough ranking of which of their draft assets are the most to least valuable. And I don't remember the exact order because this was a long time ago. But that Lakers pick, top 4 protected in 2027, was somewhere in towards the bottom. It was middle to bottom in the ranking that this person rattled off to me. And when I said, oh, that's kind of odd, I would have thought that Lakers pick would have been valued higher, the comment made to me was, well, the Lakers rarely truly bottom out. Because of their market, they rarely truly. So the Jazz, when they acquired that pick, they knew that eventually the Lakers were going to do something to redefine the post-LeBron era.
And I admittedly have a lot of recency bias with the Lakers picks, because I keep thinking about how they were had high enough draft picks to get Ingram and Russell and Lonzo Ball. Like I keep thinking about, well, the Lakers were bad for quite a while, but that really was a rare stretch in their franchise history.
So, all of that is a way of saying, like, and by the way, we don't know yet that Luka Doncic is going to be on that roster in 26-27. That's the year exactly after his player option. We don't know. Maybe he is on their roster. We don't know if he'll be healthy that season. This is a guy who's missed games here and there. Who's, his team right now his former team before this trade was hanging around in the play-in. Like, even if Luka's there, you don't know that he's going to be healthy and necessarily. I mean, he's a crazy talented player. I'm not trying to suggest that he's less than what he is, but in a given year with the wrong health challenges, it's not crazy to think that could still be a mid-first rounder that year, or that he walks. Frankly, I mean, he could walk. We don't know that he has any kind of loyalty to the Lakers franchise. He just got there, and frankly, he's probably not feeling that loyal towards anyone, since reports are that the man literally cried over getting surprise traded from the only NBA franchise he's ever known. So I still think that there's some unknowns with this pick. I still think there's some variability, but even before they were offered this chance to help out with this deal, I don't think the Jazz viewed that pick as a very likely top 10 pick. I think they viewed that as a pick belonging to a franchise that usually finds a way to be mediocre to good at worst.
Yeah, and I got to give great marks to Rob Pelinka for cultivating this relationship with Nico Harrison over a decade, which is how he got this trade done. If you look at Pelinka's history as operating as a pure GM, it's not great, man. Like, he is not a very savvy team builder in the broadest sense. Like, LeBron deciding to go to LA is not wise GM maneuvering, right? And he decimated the championship roster in horrible move after horrible move. And this trade for Luka wasn't.
And it took them like 2.5 years to recover from the Russ Westbrook trade.
Yeah, and even if you could say they've recovered, right? Like they've had some nice little cute playoff runs, but I don't think anyone has really considered them to be a contender in any real sense since then. So there's some variability with that pick still. Luka Doncic he's a top 3 player in the NBA. I love watching him play when he's not complaining to the officials. I think he's just a delightful player to watch. But there's still some variability. This doesn't guarantee, right, contending status like it would for if we're talking about like a Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or Nikola Jokic. I think those are the only 2 players currently in the NBA where if they're on your team, you say, yeah, we know that they're going to play a lot. We know they're going to play 65, 75 plus games, and if we can get there and have some luck happen, we're a really good team because of it. Luka is right there in that next tier, so there's some variability with that. So I just wanted to close off the conversation of, like, I think the Jazz should feel great that they have a relationship with another team where they can be a trade greaser, and they got a couple second-round picks that get them in camp, get them in Summer League. Let's see what happens. Maybe they'll do some draft and stashes. Who knows? Just being in the market for something like this is something that never happened before Danny Ainge. Or if it did happen, it was just very infrequently. And so I was happy to see that. So we're gonna have an interesting end of the year to see Luka in LA. I'm sure we'll talk about it. But let's focus on Jazz stuff, because I'm sure everybody's getting lots of Luka thoughts from people other than us. But do you have any parting thoughts on the Luka trade?
If you prorate Jalen Hood-Schifino's salary, the amount that was unpaid as of the moment of the trade is about $1.53 million, which means that the Jazz basically paid $750,000 for each of those picks, and change. I'm doing this in round numbers. So, like, that is a pretty cheap price to pay to buy into the second round. So yeah, I'm not mad about the value play at all. And like I said, the Jazz could have said on principle, like, no, we're not helping you get better because we are incentivized by you being bad, and then the trade would have happened anyway, and someone else would have gotten 2 picks for cheap. So whatever, it is what it is.
Yeah. Now, you can answer no to this next question. Do you care that about the trade with the Clippers in which Drew Eubanks was shipped off to the Clippers to play backup center in a way that is marginally worse than how, or marginally better than how Mo Bamba was performing for the Clippers, in a trade that also where we lost team spokesman Patty Mills, and acquired two players who will never play for the Jazz. One for sure will never play for the Jazz. Mo Bamba has already been waived, and PJ Tucker certainly will not play for the Jazz. Do you care?
I mean, here's what I told people about that trade when it happened. It's the kind of trade that like I understand why they got it, but like you the more you learn about the details of the trade, you just like, oh, like it's really hard to get my blood pressure going in either direction on this trade. In this case, they got a single second for helping out. A lot of fans are mad they didn't get more because fans think that Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills were worth something on the trade market. I think they were not. I think they're in this deal because their salary together was in the exact right range to give the Clippers the savings they needed to get, again, just exactly under the tax, like Dallas did in their deal. In other words, I don't think the Clippers are doing this because they think Drew Eubanks is going to change their trajectory as a backup center. I think they did this just to dodge the tax and, maybe give themselves some more flexibility. The second that the Jazz acquired here, this one's a little tricky because the Jazz got an LA second in 2030, but they already had swap rates on that pick, which means really they didn't net a second rounder here, but the second rounder that they netted is whichever winds up being the worst of their own and the LA Clippers pick in 2030 because they already owned whichever one of those two was better. So that means it's not like a super high value pick, but it's an unencumbered second. It's not top 45 protected, top 50 protected, top 37 protected. It's an unencumbered second that they got, again, in exchange for two guys who not only were they not part of the future, but they were only barely part of the present, really. Drew Eubanks was 11th in minutes played on this team. Patty Mills was 15th on minutes played in this team, and both guys would have ranked lower than 11th and 15th, respectively, if Taylor Hendricks and Cody Williams were healthy. So not upset, not excited. This is just like some roster stuff, some salary constructions. The Jazz get like kind of an okay pick, like in that it's unencumbered. But, I did not go to bed that night thinking, man, they're geniuses. How did they pull this off?
But it sounds like you care, and that was my question.
I mean, I care in that someone's got to do the spreadsheet bullshit.
Yeah,
someone's got to build the big graphics, and I'm fascinated by all this stuff on just the transactional level. I don't like the results of this particular trade will do nothing to change my or your life, other than we'll get fewer fun Patty Mills Instagrams. That's about it.
Yeah, look, I follow every player and the wife and or girlfriend of every player, and that was one of the more fun players and wives that we've had. Like, just a very eclectic, fun couple to follow. But sorry if you're not on the Jazz, I don't follow you. I'm not going to keep tabs on you. And I mean, this is one of those trades that's it was initiated by the Clippers for sure. They're the ones trying to get under their tax. They're the ones trying to get a warm body other than PJ Tucker to kind of operate in those spots. So good on them. Last season, Phoenix made a bunch of minimum signings that we all praised as saying, hey, they don't have a lot of options. This is a great way to kind of fill out the roster with players who can put in real minutes. And Drew Eubanks was one of those players for Phoenix. And that was the first time that I had really... I've been following Drew Eubanks for a while because he's had some surprisingly effective backup minutes in Portland and San Antonio, and he was miserable for Phoenix last year. And I thought, okay, bring him in this year, and just having like a warm body that can set screens and just be a veteran presence for young players to like teach Kyle Filipowski how to set a screen, right? Like that there could be some utility in that. And I was really disappointed in watching him. I knew he was also kind of like a miscreant on the court, and some of his antics were more annoying than fiery, right? And I won't miss him. And that's all we'll have to say about Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills' experience on the Utah Jazz.
I think I'm more sympathetic to Drew than you ever have been, and that's okay to have you know, like I do like from a locker room perspective, I do think it's fun when the team has a guy who just won't take shit from anybody. Um, and especially a young team that like so many of these guys just live their lives like deer in headlights. I think having a Drew Eubanks on your team is fun. But yeah, he wasn't changing anything about their basketball identity other than, a much higher percentage of their possessions being spent on 12-foot hook shots. So, cool, have fun. We'll see you on Saturday, Drew Eubanks. We're headed to the wall. And that's about how much I care about his departure. Although, again, there's a reason why the Jazz wanted grown-ups in the room. There's a reason why they signed Drew Eubanks and Patty Mills last summer, and maybe now they've just figured that guys have been around the camp counselors enough that now they can exist on their own for 2 months of the season.
Yeah, and now we can talk about the kind of what else to expect for the Jazz and the rest of this trade deadline, because there are so many options for the Jazz and frankly teams that should be interested in some things that the Jazz have to offer. I would love to start out by talking about Colin Sexton, because I think you and I are also, we tend to be in lockstep on some things, but I think we're also a little surprised as to the tepid response around the league about the quality of Colin Sexton and what he can do on the court and his efficiency. Yes, not a pure point guard who is really going to elevate your dependent threats like De'Aaron Fox, right, going to San Antonio, and obviously going to really help elevate teams to that respect. But he's done so many good things from an efficiency and decision-making perspective over the past 2 years that I just see him as immediately helping a team that says, look, we may not be in the S tier of contenders right now, but if we can get some juice and some minutes across other areas of the roster, if we stay healthy, we can be dangerous. And he is exactly the kind of player that can really contribute in that sort of way, I think, especially because the salary is low enough. Now, he did just sprain his ankle yesterday. It looked pretty gnarly, but the Jazz did announce a few hours ago that he'll be reevaluated in 1 week. Now, reevaluation is the most perfect PR thing that was invented, because that can mean anything. Does not mean that he's actually going to come back in a week, and the reevaluation can be like, well, we'll reevaluate him in a week and say like, oh yeah, it's a grade 3 sprain, he's going to be out for the rest of the season, right? And surely any trade involving Sexton, they won't consummate that trade without having a real pinpoint accuracy as like, surely you have had an MRI done, report on these things. Can we get Colin Sexton back? So that's maybe a little bit of a mystery. But let's assume he's out for 3 weeks, right? Just try to treat him nicely with kid gloves a little bit and try to get him back. He makes a very reasonable salary. I don't necessarily think that Utah fans should expect that a first-round pick, or especially a good first-round pick, is on the table for Sexton, because I feel like the general nature around the league is he's not worth a first-round pick. But do you think there are teams that could talk themselves into it?
Yes. Especially before the injury, yes. I think that I wouldn't be surprised to learn that there is more of a Colin Sexton market than we've heard about. I don't think you're going to get an unprotected first for Colin. I think you could get, a lottery protected first or a top 18 protected first or something like that. I also think that the Jazz view Colin as a little bit different than how they view John Collins or Jordan Clarkson, for example, just because Colin is at an age where you can imagine some scenarios where Colin is still a useful part of the Jazz rotation the next time they're good. I think they're glad they signed him to a 4-year deal. Remember, he was a sign and trade. And that's another thing that kind of, I think, has to factor in a little bit, is the fact that, the Jazz got him in the Donovan Mitchell trade, but Jazz fans may not realize his part of that trade was a sign and trade. He had to sign on a piece of paper that said, yes, I know I'm doing this to be traded to go play for the Utah Jazz. And he wanted to do that, obviously, partially because that's the only place he was going to get the money he was going to get at that particular juncture. But also just, he wanted to be here. he lets Will coach the crap out of him. I mean, Will is hard on Colin Sexton, and Colin loves that and welcomes that. And, I think back to your point about the type of point guard he is, it's funny. And I don't want to get too like advanced stats here and get down a rabbit hole on like, but Colin Sexton is good, because I don't think I need to convince you, and hopefully I don't have to convince too many Jazz fans. But at one point last season, I went and I was just curious to see, like, okay, so the book on Sexton is that he's this weird bulldog driver guy, but that we don't really think of him like we think of the game's best on-ball creators, because he just does it differently. So I went to look, like, how does his passing on drives compare to all-star guards? How does his ability to get fouled on drives compare to all-star guards? How does his turnover rate get compared to all-star guards? And what I kind of concluded after doing that, and by the way, I've revisited those numbers since then, and they all kind of hold up, is that he's not doing anything different than the aggregate group of, like, quote unquote all-star guards. He just doesn't look like Tyrese Halliburton when he does it. And so I think that the valuation of Colin Sexton is kind of funny in that way. I think Colin is a guy the Jazz will obviously trade him for the right return, but I don't think he's someone they are quote unquote shopping. I think someone's going to have to make a real offer to get him. And I think that that's less likely now that he's on the injured reserve for some length of time.
One aspect of this season that I was adamant about, and I'm very happy, I think, to be proven right, is the Jazz can be very bad in the win-loss column with players that we like and want and are currently pretty good going forward. It requires, with certain players, a little bit of uncomfortable conversations about sit-start decisions, having a butt bruise like go on for weeks, even though like the player is eligible to play. So as you're looking at Keontae George and Isaiah Collier and the players we draft in this upcoming draft, the value of having Colin Sexton around is to identify, okay, if we're in 2027, 2028, and we are now kind of in this Houston Rockets situation of, all right, now we got the young players we like. We got our Alperen Sengun, whoever that is, like that quality player. We got our Amen Thompson, right? We got our Jalen Green, like varying levels of okay to very promising prospects. Let's throw a bunch of mid-tier veterans at the problem and see if we can end up second place in the West like the Rockets are right now. Colin Sexton is already that player, and he's young enough where you can say, okay, instead of signing Fred VanVleet or making overtures for Brook Lopez or signing Dylan Brooks to massive contracts, maybe you can already have that. It is a very reasonable price in-house, because that sign and trade, that was a very reasonable contract. And if the market is tepid as it has been for his trade value, perhaps then an extension, right, can be built off of that, or his bird rights in free agency. So it's like, if the return isn't good on the trade market, I don't think Colin Sexton is going to magically help this team win 38 games next year and screw us over out of another draft pick or whatever. He's just bad enough that keep him around. Like, he's been the only player playing on some of these games with no other starter playing, and the Jazz very comfortably will lose those games.
Well, yeah, that and I don't know. I don't want to pretend that Colin is going to turn into, more than what he is suddenly at age 26. I think that if he is still around on the next second round playoff version of the Jazz, it's probably in the Jordan Clarkson role. It's probably more as like bench spark plug, change of pace guy, whatever. And that's fine. Like, playoff teams need those guys. You need your, what Jordan Clarkson was for the last iteration of the good Jazz. You need that, and Colin happens to be a much more efficient version of that, because he gets to the free throw line whenever the hell he wants.
He's several tiers above Jordan Clarkson ever was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So, I actually think that it's more likely that if Colin Sexton ever leaves the Jazz via trade, it's more likely that he's part of the next trade they make for an upgrade, like a buyer trade, where the team is going to want a bunch, they're going to want a crap load of first round picks and whatever, which the Jazz can certainly meet that asking price, but they're also going to want like a good player or two in the matching salary. And I think that's more likely for Colin Sexton than that they just let him go for like, a top 19 protected first. I think he's too good for that, and maybe not good enough to ever be like the third best player on a contending version of the Jazz. So that's probably the most likely outcome. But I love Colin. Colin is a player to steal a Pereira-ism, because you say this a lot in the way you talk about the Jazz. Like, Colin is a player who brings me joy. I enjoy watching Colin Sexton do Colin Sexton things. I love watching the little moments where he goes inexplicably and suddenly insane for like 45 seconds and like hits the floor and runs all over. And like, I love everything about the Colin Sexton experience. So I'm actually kind of comforted because I don't think he'll get traded this week. I really don't. And if he does, it'll be, I don't think it'll be just for some kind of crap asset.
Yeah, it's eventually you get to the situation where it's just it's worth keeping those guys around instead of just taking a bad pick. Unlike, for instance, just if I could compare it to something, finding Simone Fontecchio off of nowhere and getting a very, very early second round pick that turned out to be Kyle Filipowski that's great. That's like, okay, that is the value he had on the market. There's no reason to keep Fontecchio around for a couple years. He was going to be a free agent, so yeah, all right, let's make that trade. Kelly Olynyk, he was 30,000 years old, and Ochai Agbaji, they didn't believe in him. They said, okay, their value equaled this first round pick. Let's make that trade. If there's more value to Sexton being on the team, and I keep coming back to the fact that like he's not helping them win too many games, right? He's not this all-star level player. So it's worth keeping him around, and I think his competitive spirit makes practice probably a little bit better, right? You can't just loaf around in practice because no matter how much Will Hardy coaches him super, super hard and he lets that in, it doesn't dampen his competitive spirit and the way he levels up those practices, I imagine. So, and with players who maybe have kind of perhaps less intense motifs to their play, like Keontae and Isaiah Collier at times, like it's all right, like kind of like having that guy around. So we shall see with all these players, but I tend to agree that Sexton may not be moved. The thumb on the scale for that, though, is now we have two competing thumbs on either side of the scale. One, you have the injury that really makes it, I don't know if a team really wants to take that on, but he never gets hurt otherwise and he can recover fast. The other side is his contract is very easy to move around. You can fit that in a lot of different places. Doesn't quite fit into a mid-level exception or anything, but it won't require secret phone calls to Danny Ainge, right? The equivalent of that to be like, we need to figure out how to get this deal done. It'll be very easy to kind of figure out how Sexton moves around. So I'll let you pick the next player on what you think of the trade market for them this year. We got a lot of options.
Well, I think in terms of interest level index, the most logical place to go next is John Collins, because there is that rumor out there where a Sacramento media personality who's not known for shooting from the hip. This isn't like our version of what's the guy that nobody here, the guy. Why am I blinking on the guy? Monty. This isn't like, just someone who just kind of has a reputation for like, broken clocks are right twice a day, so I'm just going to put some stuff out there and eventually one of these will hit. So this guy from Sacramento, who, again, my point here is he's not that dude, was explaining on his radio show that the Kings at one point had a deal basically done for a player. It was to the point they were close enough to consummating that they had started to notify the Kings players who were involved in the trade, and then they walked it back. And then later someone asked him, hey, was that for John Collins? And he just simply said, yes. So, assuming that this guy's sources are right, John Collins was, I don't know if this is true, this is not my reporting, John Collins was like almost a member of the Sacramento Kings at some point last week until they shifted gears and started looking into the Aaron Fox option. Now, even after the Fox trade, the reporting is that the Kings still want to be, aggressive and still want to think about what they could do to upgrade their roster. They're in a weird spot where they, from a team building standpoint, they really probably shouldn't be making win now moves, quote unquote, but they're also like not going to be bad. So you might as well just, if there's something you could do that's kind of asset neutral that brings you, a player that maybe fits a little bit differently. So I think the Kings are probably, still somewhat in the mix. And then, who knows? People have commented all year that Collins makes a lot of sense for teams like New Orleans. He could make sense in a place like Philadelphia. Those are two teams that probably, if they know what's best for them, should just go ahead and be bad for the rest of the year because New Orleans is not making the playoffs. Philadelphia still could because the Eastern Conference is the Eastern Conference, and you can basically screw around for 50 games and still have an outside shot at making the playoffs. So, this is a long way of saying I think that there are some John Collins bits out there. I was shocked to hear in this rumination about the Sacramento rumor that there was a first involved for John. I can't imagine it was unprotected. I would imagine it was heavily protected, or at least decently protected. Because I can guarantee you for sure that 4 months ago there was not a first on the market for John Collins. Credit him. He's had a hell of a year. He's turned some things around. He's shooting the crap out of the ball from 3-point land. But it still seems weird to me that the value would shift that much in 4 months to where he basically was bad salary, and now he might fetch a first somewhere, even if it's a protected one.
46% from three, which is by far a career high. On a fair amount of attempts per game, I think he is being left a little bit open on some teams' game plans. They really should start fixing those game plans because he is sinking the wide open ones. 55% from the corners. So he's a bona fide good 3-point shooter now. He's not a bomber, right? He's not just unconscionably hoisting them up, but you do wonder hey, in the right system, are the teams going to think hey, no, we want to encourage that shooting, because he's always been a high flyer, a great dunker, but he is shooting a career low percentage at the rim. Not preposterous or anything, but he's shooting 67% at the rim, where he's usually been in the 70s. That could be Utah is a terrible basketball team, so sometimes small blips in percentage are okay, well, he's probably getting a lot of attention at the rim. Lowry is shooting horribly at the rim, and I don't think that's going to persist. But he is shooting an incredible amount from three, which is much more of a marker of okay, there is something real here with how many shots he's taking, how many games he's played. That looks legit and real. And noting that the salary dump that Atlanta had to do, he was shooting 29% from three, which was a career low, right? And so Utah bought at his lowest possible value and might even get a first-round pick out of it. I assume the first-round pick, not only would it be not unprotected, there would be some protections on it, but it would involve Utah taking some unsavory salary, perhaps, on the way back. But no team really takes on horrific salary just for fun. It would just be kind of medium bad salary, and Utah has the team plan to kind of take on some bad salary for at least 2 years, right? Won't be that big of a deal. And sometimes this bad salary, right? If Kevin Huerter wasn't going to Chicago, I would talk more about Kevin Huerter, but he's an example of, okay, his contract is bad, but at the time he signed it, he was coming off a good year, and that was considered a nice little contract for Kevin Huerter and would fit on a lot of different teams. So is there something salvageable with Kevin Huerter if you put him in a different environment, right? Was his confidence sapped in Sacramento? And so I'm very curious to see what happens in Chicago. That's the type of bad salary that I'm hoping Utah takes on. So John Collins is now a player that these playoff teams should be thinking this guy is going to come off the bench and help us. Just like what I said about Colin Sexton, if you can bring him in as a backup, right, a 20 to 25 minute a game backup, maybe even some sort of non-closing starter perhaps, 5th, 6th, 7th man, it's not immediately catapulting you to the top of your conference or whatever, like we suggested about the Kevin Durant trade or whatever when it happened. But it is the type of thing that if you are healthy and you get yourself to the Western Conference Finals and all of your dudes are healthy, then John Collins is a guy that is beating up on your Western Conference Finals opponent, right? Who is maybe not as healthy. Now you're in the finals, right? And getting to the finals, as we've seen with injuries and injuries and injuries, if you can get there reasonably healthy with a deep squad and you got 8 guys who can really play, John Collins should be one of them, and he's winning you a title. Like that is a guy that you can feel confident in putting out there. And Dan, we couldn't say that last year. It's remarkable how much he's turned it around. I think his attitude is incredible. I think he's showing why he's not just like, oh, throw him in 10,000 pick and rolls and throw him lobs. He's a much more nuanced basketball player, and they figured that out this year, and he's gotten a lot better because of it. And so I think a lot of teams are seeing like, hey, this isn't just a player who fits one archetype, and we'll have to figure that out with our point guard or whatever. He's a player that we can deploy in a lot of different ways because he can still do the high-flying, rim-dunking, acrobatic stuff, but now he's got a lot more nuance to his game that he can kind of mold with some teams. And his salary is high, but that can almost be a benefit because now we can take on worse salaries, some of these really bloated, awful contracts from other teams, and maybe improve some of the draft assets. But like Colin Sexton, I will say, I never thought I'd say it to him, John Collins giving me a lot of joy this year.
Likewise. I mean, I'll say a couple of things about the John Collins thing. Number one is his chemistry lately with Isaiah Collier. A lot of Isaiah Collier's assists are trailers to John Collins for a dunk in transition, alley-oops to John Collins slipping out of the pick and roll. Isaiah has found a little comfort zone with John, and so that's kind of fun.
And let me build off that real quick, because this is, again, another example of why you and I have insisted having competent veterans on the team helps these young players. And it's not going to torpedo the Jazz draft stock because they have John Collins playing 40, 50 games. They can manage those minutes. They can lose enough games. And now we're talking about Isaiah Collier maybe figuring something out. If he's got Micah Potter playing those minutes, he ain't figuring that out. It helps to have somebody who can have that verticality and that dynamicism. Like, that is helping Collier, whereas a replacement or very likely a worse player, we're not seeing that out of Collier, and we're not having a little bit more enthusiasm about Collier over the past couple of weeks that we've had.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean that's exactly it. The Jazz want to the Jazz are obviously prioritizing draft position, but they also want for the basketball reps that these guys are getting this year to mean something, so that in a couple of years when they're trying to be good again, like these minutes that Collier has played, or these minutes that Keontae George is playing, or whatever happens with Cody Williams, like they want for this to have meant something, and so you do have to have grown-ups in the room. The other thing I would say about John's value, and this is just to be a little devil's advocate on really to myself, because now I'm kind of arguing against the point I made about his value. Like, from a macro, I don't think he's a widely different player than he was at the end of his Atlanta. Like, he's that's kind of what he's done this season, other than the three-point shooting, which obviously is a career level. But outside of that, what he's mostly done is just kind of gotten himself back to late-stage Atlanta level. And that version of John was still negligible enough in terms of macro value that the Jazz were basically able to get him for free, for Rudy Gay's corpse and a fake second. Now, obviously, that was when he had 4 years of salary left at $25 million per. Now he has a season and a half left of salary at that range. So I do think that that's a little bit different too, and that's kind of what the Jazz banked on all along. They made that deal because, number one, if you're a rebuilding team and someone offers you a 25-year-old, was he 25 then? I think he was 20. No, he was 26 then. Now he's 27. Whatever. If you're a rebuilding team and someone offers you a mid-20s guy who has averaged 20 a game and they're giving you him for free, you say yes, and you just figure out if he's a fit and if he means something to the long term or not. And the other reason they made it is because they were confident that as the contract went along, there would reach a point where his basketball value caught up with the amount of dollars remaining on his contract. And I think we're there. And I think that's why we're hearing John's name now, because a year and a half look, in this new NBA economy, 20 to 25 million is just starter money. Like, it sounds like a lot to schlubs like us. 20 to 25 million is just what you're going to pay for your fourth or fifth best starter in the NBA going forward, unless your fourth or fifth best starter happens to still be on a rookie deal, in which case you're incredibly lucky and you have a draft pick that paid off well and quickly. For the most part, John is just a starter level guy making starter level money in a league where the salaries are exploding, and it's not a bad contract anymore. It's a contract that's just kind of like, okay, that's commensurate with what he is. So that's helpful, and it's part of the reason why a John Collins trade in the next 40 however many hours wouldn't shock me.
Like Sexton, if John Collins was still on the roster next year and they go into the trade deadline with him next year, we're having the same exact conversation, right? And then he's on an expiring deal, and a team can really think about, like, okay, if we trade for John Collins, we'll have his bird rights, we can re-sign him, we can really build something, right? He'd be a great fit next to Luka Doncic, I think, right? And you can start thinking about that. The Utah Jazz don't have to take a bad deal for Collins because he does have that additional year left, and maybe the deals will be better in the offseason. Maybe the deals will be better going into next year. But it is worth noting that props to John Collins, props to the Jazz, props to Will Hardy for really recovering what was special about John Collins in his Atlanta tenure and adding some new elements. And he's been a joy to watch. His ferocity has been great. And if we somehow lose both Sexton and John Collins, this team becomes incredibly unwatchable, not just from a talent standpoint, but from like a give a shit standpoint. And I think that's always been really appreciated, regardless of Collins' play on the court. Walker Kessler, I think, is the next natural player to talk about, especially because I thought it was so funny hearing Rob Pelinka's press conference with Luka today. As soon as I got an alert that they were doing the press conference, I immediately turned it on because I needed to hear everything out of Pelinka's mouth about building this team. Because this team has LeBron and Luka, and Austin Reeves has had frankly a pretty nice year as a ball handler. He's one of my least favorite players to watch in the league based on how he flails and draws fouls. But man, he's producing, he's playing well. So you got three kind of large ball handlers, and Gabe Vincent hasn't been very good, and he's been very injured. And they have arguably zero competent big men on the entire roster, right? If you can, like, Hachimura is a 4 or whatever. Jackson Hayes is arguably out of the league if he wasn't given a 1+1 by Pelinka the last time he signed a contract. So you have Pelinka sitting there on the stage being like, market's really dry for centers. There's not many that are available. And I just, you can never tell if the shit that comes out of these people's mouths is gamesmanship or not, because a lot of teams have bandied about, like, hey, we've made offers for Walker Kessler, like, oh, the Knicks offered 2 first-round picks, but you start to dig a little deeper and you realize the Knicks offered 2 horrible, non-useful first-round picks, and that would have been a terrible deal. And who knows if the Utah's actually calling around about Walker Kessler. There's been no indication that he's being shopped or anything. It sounds like there's a lot of these teams kind of calling up and being like, hey, what is it going to take to get off of Walker Kessler? And they've been disappointed with it. So hearing Pelinka say, this incredibly center star of team who may not be competing this year if they get a center, but they certainly want a center to pair with Luka going forward, given that they're starting from nothing. To hear Pelinka say the market is dry for centers when they have their unprotected 2031 pick out there and Walker Kessler sitting right there, I mean, he's not going to implicate Walker Kessler live on stage, that's tampering, whatever. But it's interesting to hear how emphatic he was that the market for centers was dry. And the Lakers are just one team. But I think it is indicating that what we have said for a long time, Danny Ainge isn't calling 29 teams saying, what are you offering for Walker Kessler? He's just not hanging up the phone when they're calling to ask about him. He's had a nice year, and I think it's going to take a sizable offer to get off of him. I've been kind of vocal that I'm not going to love paying the next Walker Kessler contract, at the time that we're going to have to give it to him. But I'm not really that worried about it yet. It feels like more of like a later problem. And he's not so amazing that you'll have to give him some incredible contract. Or like a crazy contract. I think the contract that the Clippers gave Ivica Zubac is very indicative of like, that's a reasonable starter center. Like, we can do something with that and be competitive. He fits great with Lowry. So I don't see Walker Kessler getting traded this week unless some team is like, there's some 3 or 4 team trade where a team is losing their center and acquiring a star, and they found another way to get Walker Kessler in the building to help make a championship contender right now with him as their starter. But I don't really have a great read on it other than that.
Would it surprise you to learn that this is the summer that Walker Kessler will negotiate his extension?
It won't. That's the thing. Is like this is where the extension is going to happen, right? So it won't. Right. It won't kick in for another year. Yeah. Right, but like, so that's the pain of that contract will be deferred for a year. But this is the summer, right? He had a good year to earn a nice new contract, but I am a little apprehensive of what that number is going to be.
So can I draw from everything you just said the insinuation that what you're saying is that it surprises you if the 2031 Lakers pick were on the table for Walker Kessler, that you would be surprised about the Jazz not taking it?
Oh, I would be surprised if that's the only thing that they took for him. I think he is worth far more than just the 2031 pick. I think it is notable that Pelinka is on stage saying like they still have a juicy asset, right? That 2031 pick. When everything you just said about the Lakers' quality is still, notwithstanding, that's a quality unprotected pick. And if that is absolutely a non-starter for Danny Ainge, then I'm not sure what other trades are out there that teams would be willing to offer for Walker Kessler that Ainge would be happy with.
It's funny how often we come around to this narrative of like the age of NBA centers being over, and then you see teams getting stuck precisely because they can't find someone for the Ivica Zubac role, which doesn't mean that, Ivica Zubac doesn't play every minute for the Clippers, but like, Dallas had to go get Daniel Gafford to put next to Derek Lively in order to get it past the second round of the playoffs. And now the Lakers are going to be talking for the next couple of seasons about what it's going to take to find a center to put alongside Luka and LeBron. And, the Suns thought they had an answer at center, and now Yusuf Nurkic, I don't know, sucks all of a sudden. So it is funny. And that's why I'm not, like, as long as what we're talking about for Walker Kessler is like starter money and not like, look, I was always among the chief drivers of the Rudy Gobert has superstar value, even though he doesn't look like a superstar guy. But the reality is it was tough to pay him like he was a top 15 offensive player, even though he probably was a top 15 impact player. If that's where the negotiations go with Kessler, that's where I get nervous. If they can get him for, Zubac's money adjusted for inflation, or which frankly is not that different from like Derek Favors' money adjusted for inflation. Now, when Derek Favors extended his rookie contract, that was a long ass time ago, and the NBA economy is completely different now. But if you look at what $12 million per in year of our Lord 2014 translates to in today's NBA economy, like, I think that's a reasonable place for Walker Kessler where I wouldn't be upset if they extended him. For all those reasons, I have never been given any indication that the Jazz are seriously considering moving Walker Kessler.
And if the parties can't agree on an extension, you still got restricted free agency, right? You still have a time after that where the Utah is still in control, and it seems like the relationship is good where they're not necessarily pissing off their player if you have to get to restricted free agency as a concept. Now, if you force him to go get offer sheets and stuff, you can damage a relationship. We've seen that with Gordon Hayward in the past, right? So maybe you don't want to take it to its natural end game, but not agreeing to an extension right now this summer is a death knell for Walker Kessler in Utah.
When the whole is Lauri Markkanen actually on the market thing happened last year, where I came away after talking to a bunch of smart people, some in the Jazz, some around the Jazz, whatever, was that the Jazz's position on Markkanen was never, please come get him from us, price is listed on the board. It was, hey, I don't want to trade Lauri Markkanen. So if I'm going to trade him, you're going to have to make me have to trade him. You're going to have to come with an offer that makes me go, shoot, now I got to call Danny and I got to call Ryan and we got to have a meeting and we got to talk about this and whatever. Like that was the sense I got. It's probably less strong for Walker because Walker is on a macro level not as good as peak Lauri Markkanen. But I think it's kind of the same for him, where it's like this is not a player who's on sale. This is like hey, if you make us have to think about it, we'll think about it, and that's I think as far as Walker's market goes. So I think that this is another example of where someone's name is appearing in the rumor mill almost 100% as a result of other teams wishing he were gettable, as opposed to really someone being, on the market in a traditional sense. What I'm saying here is Walker Kessler will be a Jazz man on Friday.
Yeah, and like Rudy Gobert with Quinn Snyder, there's a certain thing I appreciate that Walker Kessler and Will Hardy are figuring this out together, and what makes Walker tick. Like Walker kind of learning how to be a rugged NBA center day in and day out and getting coached by Will Hardy, and Will Hardy kind of figuring out how to coach all these players, but definitely his connection with these young players and them starting day one together, right, as a rookie and a rookie head coach. I've really been encouraged by Kessler's kind of attitude this year, and that's a player I kind of want to keep around, as all of a sudden Kessler's got the 5-6 years of experience. We're bringing in these more rookies and more young players, and he's like, look, I used to be the really nice guy too. So I would like to have Kessler around going forward. Look, the rest of the roster is a combination of, and I'm also referencing Ken Clayton's list right now to make sure I don't forget anybody. So please, if you're listening to this, look at Ken Clayton's article on Salt City Hoops real quickly to give you a sense of, all right, real quickly, what are the Jazz doing at the deadline? Who's eligible, who's not? So it's a combination of total flotsam. It doesn't care if the Jazz move them. It doesn't matter. Like, you will not care at all. Our young talent, right? Your Keontae Georges, your Bryce Sensabaugh, if they get moved, could be an interesting little piece of business for the Jazz, for a team maybe trying to shuffle around some talent deck chairs. Who knows? Very similar to Ochai Agbaji last year, right? Where it's like, oh, we kind of liked Agbaji's performance last year, but he was just okay. Turns out, got a first-round pick out of it, right? If you combine Jordan Clarkson and Bryce Sensabaugh, could you steal something, right? Like, we'll see. And then, yes, the other players, like Jordan Clarkson is probably going to have to pay to get off of him. Johnny Juzang, like, there's just players that I'm just not really going to care about if they move here or there from, as far as the Jazz, what the Jazz could get back in return. I'll be sad if Jordan Clarkson leaves, but I don't think he's on the table. The last thing I think we should talk about, if you have a thought, is there any, we've exclusively talked about the Jazz as sellers, and that's all the Jazz have done. The shifting around of the draft picks with Phoenix is nor buyer nor seller. Is there any sort of concept or even specific players where you're thinking the Jazz should really be buying on that type of player, or what's happening there?
I think where I land on that is like, and this is the same way I think about guys on the current roster, right? Like, question number one is, are you going to be a difference maker in 3 years when the Jazz are trying to make it out of the first round of the playoffs? Lauri Markkanen, the answer could be yes if he's still around. Colin Sexton, the answer could be yes. Keontae George, Bryce Sensabaugh, all the young guys, the Jazz hope the answer is yes. We don't know yet. Jordan Clarkson, the answer is almost surely no. And that's why Jordan Clarkson comes up a lot in trade talks from Jazz fans' side of things. The next question is, okay, but could you be a high minute reserve? Could you be the fifth best starter, or, one of the first three guys off the bench for that version of the Jazz? and I tend to think that like you kind of worry about that tier of player later once you know who your three best players are or your two best players or whatever. Um, so I think I'd be nervous about doing a going fully into buyer mode until we know what the Jazz are drafting this summer, because you could if we wanted to sit here and map out a pathway for the Jazz to do kind of a quicker version of the rebuild. That version is you get lucky in May. In June, you draft one of Cooper Flag, Ace Bailey, Dylan Harper. Other people have other guys in their mix. I think those are the three guys who the Jazz feel would kind of change their future. And then you go make that buyer trade where you add a third guy who's either an all-star or kind of a borderline all-star where, like Lowry, you think he has another level in it, right? Um, Now, if that type of guy became available today, would you do it and just hope that you can still get Cooper, Ace, Dylan in the draft? Maybe you do if the timing is right, because this isn't an on-demand thing where you decide like, okay, now I'm ready to trade for De'Aaron Fox. Oh, wait, De'Aaron Fox isn't on the market? Oh, shoot, I thought I could just wish that into existence. So, there is a list. I've posted it before. I'll have to see if I can access it quickly because I'm vamping. But like, there is a list of guys who I would define as like borderline all-star types, where if they came available at some point, I think the Jazz would do well to go see if they can get them. That list includes guys like De'Aaron Fox, who are sort of like, I've been an all-star once or twice. I'm fringe all NBA level, so I'm probably not untouchable, whatever. De'Aaron Fox is now off the market, so I'm only bringing up his name as kind of an archetype. And then there's the tier of guys like, I think if Jaden McDaniels ever became available, I think he could be a really interesting third or fourth guy if the Jazz know who their first and second and third guys are. He is having a crappy year from three, but usually he's a good three-point shooter. He can put the ball on the deck a little bit, kind of like Markkanen. He's not going to be a full-time creator, but like against a closeout, he can put the ball on the floor and move it a little bit. And he's one of the game's 10 best wing defenders, and I think that matters. And so there are players like that if they just somehow became available, I think you'd have to think about it, even though it might mean you win 5 more games than you want to win in the last 2 months of the season. Does that answer the question? I feel like
no. There's not going to be any specific players out there, right? It's going to be there's so many random players to take random bets on at this point that I feel like a lot of those conversations happen more in the offseason than perhaps right now, right? Because the type of player you're trying to buy as the Jazz to maybe craft your future, those are conversations you have as far as much broader with other teams who are also having these wider conversations on where their players fit long term. Whereas the deals that are happening at the deadline are, let's get our finances right and let's go win an NBA championship, right? It's rarely you're getting sort of like talent plays to kind of craft the future of both rosters a little bit. So I think it's going to be more on like the financial side where the Jazz might be the beneficiary of some talent if the Jazz can make the finances for their trade partners a little bit better. A couple random things is like, and I always love, it never works out, but I will always be enamored with taking a chance on second draft guys, right? Where their first 2 seasons in the NBA have been total shit, and all right, put him with Will Hardy. I think Will Hardy's going to get something out of him. Let's get him in the building. Guy like Dalen Terry, right? He's done nothing in Chicago, right? Get him in the building. I actually don't even know if his option was picked up or not. This is just a random player I thought of who's not playing from a draft a couple seasons ago. All right, let's get him in the building. A player who's maybe a little bit older and whose money is preposterous, and I've called the worst contract in the NBA. But a player who, as I'm watching the NBA the other night, I see has 5 blocks and looks pretty great out there suddenly all out of nowhere. Zeke Naji for the Denver Nuggets, who has this preposterous contract extension in Denver. It's not like a preposterous amount of money or anything, but he got a significant 4-year extension after not really doing anything in the NBA. So he's really struggled in Denver when he's gotten chances to have significant minutes. He can't get minutes over the likes of DeAndre Jordan, but is there something there? He's 24. Should the Jazz the Jazz can afford the money? We'll see. So I would love little talent plays like that. Like, let's see what get him in the building. Let's see what happens.
So you're not even talking about like a buyer trade in the sense of like an upgrade. You're talking about just like a raw shot at something that might be there.
Yeah, because we talk about the season's Jazz as like offloading our shit, right? Giving it like we'll take the highest price that we can get for these players, or we'll just keep them. But we don't really talk about Utah canvassing the market and being like, "Hey, Denver, Zeke Naji's adding a lot to your tax bill. Would you like a second round pick for that?" Like, things like that where Utah is the buyer, but they're not making them win games now or even next year.
I think the Jazz only go after Zeke Naji if it's Denver putting a second pick with him. Frankly, I just think values the salary.
Sorry, I think you're absolutely right. I think Denver would absolutely have to pay to get off that contract.
but I get your point that like there's probably someone out there who's like interesting and not in the right situation to flourish, and maybe that's what the Jazz try next. That's essentially what they did with some of their rebuild trades that they have made, especially the early ones. The late ones have mostly been about trying to make it harder for Will Hardy to accidentally win games.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, for real. Here's I'm just going to blow through this quickly because we're on minute 70 of this podcast. Here's a list I put together last summer. This is old. This is outdated. But what this was based on is guys who at that point had, I think I did 3 years of contract left, because I don't think the Jazz are going to trade for a guy that they only have like 18 months to convince that, hey, Utah doesn't suck, please stay here. And I have them kind of broken into tiers. There's the young MVP candidates like Shea, Luka, Jokic, Antetokounmpo, and Ant. The Jazz don't have the juice to bring those players here, so just skip over that group.
And at the time you wrote that, you probably thought none of them would be traded by this point.
That is also accurate. Then there's the tier of guys who are awesome, but they're older. Kawhi Leonard, Anthony Davis, Drew Holiday, Draymond Green just don't make sense on the Jazz's timeline. Then there's the group of guys who aren't quite like MVP candidate every year level, but they're legitimate all-stars. And if any of these guys became available, I do think the Jazz would have to talk seriously about it. That's Devin Booker, Tyrese Halliburton, Sabonis, Jaylen Brown, Zion Williamson, Cat, John Morant. For a variety of reasons, most of those guys aren't actually available. But that's just kind of the next tier down. And then the next tier is where I think it gets interesting, because then you have a tier of guys with EPM wins from last season of 3 to 9, meaning they're not producing at a star level now, but they're all good. They're all locked in on pretty favorable deals. This is where your MPJs are: DeJounte Murray, Max Strus, Herb Jones, Devin Vassell. I would go get Devin Vassell, and who knows? Suddenly San Antonio has a lot of promising guards. Lou Dort, meh. Aaron Nesmith, I like. Desmond Bane, we're not going to talk about Jazz's Desmond Bane pain. Denny Avdia, I know the Jazz have liked in the past. He got traded to Portland for first. Josh Hart, Tyler Hero, here's where Jaden McDaniels comes up. Cam Johnson is known to be very on the market. Tumani Kamara, defensive-only guy.
Let me pause you there on Cam Johnson, because Brooklyn's got to get rid of Cam Johnson, right? And Utah surely can beat any offer by a contender for Cam Johnson because they have a little bit more in the kitty as far as draft picks. Is it too early for the Jazz to be buying quality like Cam Johnson?
Probably, and that's why I mentioned we kind of need to know what we're building around, in this game of NBA 2K, because let's say that the Jazz, they wind up in a position to take Ace Bailey. So now you're going to try to build a team where your three best players are Ace Bailey, Lauri Markkanen, and Cam Johnson, who are all kind of like fours, but more wingy fours, and like they're sort of the same players. So, does Cam Johnson make sense if they draft Dylan Harper? Maybe, yeah, maybe he makes more sense there. So I'm not sure I'd go get a complimentary star. Again, I think the point to me goes back to, do you change our reality, yes or no? If no, then we're probably not interested now, unless the answer to the secondary question of like, yeah, but could you kind of help in 3 to 4 years is a resounding yes. Like, that's why Colin Sexton is still on this roster, because the Jazz can imagine, at some point the Jazz are going to be good again, and they're going to either have to at that point go out and start looking for players of the quality tier of Colin Sexton and Walker Kessler, or they're going to already have those players because they kept them through this part of the cycle. I don't know which, but every team needs those guys when they start trying to win basketball games. So we need to know if the new core is Cooper Flagg and Lauri Markkanen and Tyrese Halliburton, or I'm totally making that up, by the way. This is not.
Of course.
Luckily, I'm not important enough to get aggregated. So that's
look. When the team is bad enough, you can be wistful about anything, and nobody takes you seriously.
Yeah. So anyway, I do have kind of my running list of like guys who, if they popped onto the market, like, yeah, the Jazz should go get them, even if it's weird timing with their rebuild, because you can't just snap your fingers and have them appear on your menu, when you're ready for them.
Yeah, I just look at the second deal like the Mavs did, where they swapped Quentin Grimes for Caleb Martin, which, interestingly, we talked about their tax bill. They're now back into the tax with acquiring Caleb Martin, which is fun. But it's like Quentin Grimes, young shooter who's due for a contract extension. It's like, okay, he's not really changing the Jazz present right now, but young enough, Colin Sexton style. Like, do we just get that guy in the building? And I'd be tickled if the Jazz tried something like that, but I'm not exactly angling for it. I think you're right. I think the Jazz could have any pick between 2 and 7, right? And having the 7th pick really kind of changes a lot of what's happening with the Jazz versus the 2nd pick, or ideally the 1st pick. Sorry, they can have the 1st pick. Sorry to have to put that juju out there, but second lottery.
I was going to actually you there, but
yeah. So last question for you, and you can bring us home, is Jazz have made 3 trades so far, so I'm actually kind of happy that the Jazz have been active in this past month and making some deals. Give us a random percentage, not random, but what is your percentage odds that the Jazz make any additional trade before the trade deadline?
Like 37. That's
a good random number.
In other words, I think it's less than a coin toss, just because they've already done a bunch of work. But there's a significant chance. I mean, the Jazz have players. I know we kind of skipped over Jordan. I think there's probably a way they could move Jordan in like an asset neutral trade, particularly if a team has guys in that Zeke Najee range. Like, who needs freaking guards is the team we were just talking about, the Dallas Mavericks. Now, again, it's tough for them trade wise because they've just made 2 trades, and so a lot of their tradable stuff is off the table. But between Clarkson and Collins, I don't think Sexton now, especially with the injury. I think the injury changes Sexton's trade odds just enough that I think he's safe-ish. They still have guys like Svi Mykhailiuk. The other one, honestly, and we should have devoted 5 minutes to this, but we don't have to. Like, probably the most likely Jazz player to get traded at this point, if we're honest with ourselves, is PJ Tucker.
Oh yeah, I mean that's perhaps not worth 5 minutes, but he's at least going to get a buyout of some kind. But he is a useful player, barely, who completely ran out of his welcome, but he's a tradable asset.
It's not even that necessarily. It's the fact that you could go to a team that needs help with their books and you could offer to take up to 19 million back for PJ Tucker.
Yeah.
And that deal is probably as likely. So like, here's a sampling of guys you could get for 19 million. For under what PJ Tucker's salary allows. Norman Powell, you're not getting Norman Powell because like that's the team.
For 9
that's
reasons.
The team PJ Tucker just came from. Bojan Bogdanovic, Jazz already had him. Keldon Johnson, you could get. Now the Spurs aren't in serious financial trouble. D'Angelo Russell is a no. Colin Sexton. So now I'm kind of talking myself out of it. But like you go down a little bit. Yusuf Nurkic. Yusuf Nurkic is bad salary for the Suns. What would the Suns give the Jazz to let them save $7 million in salary by getting rid of a player who has now moved from the starting lineup to barely playing? Patrick Williams is in the first year of a new 5-year deal, and he's on a team that is bad and trying to rebuild. Would they do Patrick Williams for PJ Tucker to have an expired? That might be an example of like the kind of buyer trade you were talking about, where you just go take a flyer on a guy. Now, is he good enough to be making 5 years, 90 million? I don't know. Malik Monk, probably not. Bogdanovic, probably not.
You mentioned Bogdan's had a not great year. I will mention.
And he's a little older than the Jazz are probably interested in.
But just he's the type of player where he's not good enough to change their futures at all. But it's like, okay, yeah, like competent backcourt player to shepherd some things going forward, especially if the Jazz lose Jordan Clarkson. I think the idea of maybe picking up an asset where you're saving it, laying out a bunch of money is very much on the table. All of this to say, like, I think the Jazz, like the likelihood that the Jazz make a trade, I think is actually at 60%.
Okay.
Because I think it's very likely that the Jazz get involved in a very stupid way, right? Like just irrelevant to like really much of anything, but the Jazz have too many players where the flexibility that they can provide other teams as far as the money that they can take back and the things that the constraints that the Utah Jazz do not have to help facilitate some of these other big trades, because the arms race seems to be heating up. People are going to be calling Justin and Danny to help kind of facilitate these things with the salaries that they have, even if it means involves Svi Mikhailuk. You're now a New Orleans Pelican. It'll be completely random, but we know the Jazz are on the phone helping to facilitate these trades, and they might just get a couple seconds out of it. If we're just talking about the actual players who play, I think you're right. It's more around 20-30%.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I don't know. Anything else we missed? I mean, probably not, because we've said now all the words in the English language like 3 times.
I've been refreshing the entirety of the internet, making sure we didn't miss anything while we've been recording live on this evening of February 4th, and hopefully you're listening to this on the morning of February 5th. We have a full 24, 36 hours for you all to digest what Dan and I have tried to give you.
Yep. That's Mark Barrera over there. I'm Dan Clayton. We're part of Salt City Hoops. This has been a Salt City Hoops podcast. Enjoy the trade deadline. We'll talk to you soon.